He laid the offer sheet on the kitchen table, slid it toward me, and set it in front of his brother. "You don't need to worry about the numbers. This has always been my project." I looked at the sheet. $3.1 million. I looked at Marcus, and I thought, he has never once read the deed. What he never knew was that the house he had spent 11 years renovating had never belonged to him at all. Good day, dear listeners. It's Lena again, and I'm so glad you're here with me today. Before we begin, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and tap the like button. It helps these stories reach the people who need them. And tell me in the comments which city you're listening from. I love seeing just how far these stories travel. People always say that in a marriage, everything should be shared. Every plan, every account, every decision. I used to believe that too. What I learned, slowly, over 11 years of plaster dust and contractor invoices, and the particular loneliness of being scenery in someone else's story, is that sharing requires both people to actually look. Marcus looked at the house constantly. He photographed it. He gave interviews about it. He sent progress updates to the hotel group's acquisition team, but he never once looked at the document that answered the only question that mattered: whose name was on it. Let me take you back to the beginning, because the beginning is where the truth lives. I was 48 years old when Marcus slid that offer sheet across the table. I had been a licensed historic preservation consultant for 19 years, the last 11 of them independent. Before that, a decade at the Washington State Historic Preservation Office in Olympia. My work was the careful, unglamorous reading of old documents, chain of title research, recorded instrument analysis, landmark designation applications. I could read a title abstract the way a musician reads a score. I knew which signatures mattered and which ones didn't. I knew what a revocable living trust looked like from the inside, and I knew what it meant when a property was held in one. The house was a Victorian-era craftsman in Seattle's Capitol Hill neighborhood. Ash-brown shingles and a wide front porch, dormers that caught the November fog off the Olympic Mountains, a front room with original oak floors that glowed amber in the afternoon. Capitol Hill in late autumn is the color of old copper and wet cedar, the kind of neighborhood where houses have histories longer than their owners. I had made it my work to know every layer of that history. The house had layers I had not told Marcus about, not because I was hiding anything, because he had never asked. We had moved in together in 2011. Marcus had found the listing, or so he told people, though I had emailed it to him on a Tuesday afternoon in October. He was a residential developer, and his eye for what a house could be was genuine. I will give him that. He saw the bones of the craftsman clearly, the original millwork, the salvageable plaster, the dormer that could be opened into a proper study. He threw himself into the renovation with the focused energy of a man building a monument to himself. He hired the contractors, approved the invoices, gave the press quotes. I filed the landmark designation application in 2017, handled the county records research, spent evenings reading instrument after instrument at the county offices while Marcus was photographing the progress for his portfolio. I had always known who the silent half of this project was. I had never needed him to acknowledge it. The year I obtained the landmark designation, Marcus sat across from me at this same kitchen table and said he wished I had consulted him first. The designation, he said, was going to limit the development potential of the property. I said, "I own this house, Marcus. The designation protects it." He had looked at me for a moment, and then he had moved on to something else, and neither of us had returned to the sentence. I believe now that he heard it and chose not to understand it. Some people are very skilled at that. There is a detail I have not told you yet, dear listeners, and it is the one that matters most. My great-aunt, Constance Wexler, had owned the Capitol Hill property since 1978. She was a retired school teacher who had come to Seattle from Spokane in her 30s and had bought the craftsman on savings accumulated over 20 years in a profession that does not accumulate savings easily. By 2009, she was 81, without children, with strong opinions about furniture and a very clear sense of who she trusted. She had watched me, she told me, since I was 12 years old, and had spent a summer with her cataloging her books, and had returned every one of them to its exact place. "You're a keeper," she had said. "Not everyone is." She called me on a Wednesday morning in March of 2009 and told me she wanted to deed the house to me. I was 35 and living in a rental near the university, and making a careful living at the preservation office. I told her I was grateful, but that it was too much. She told me not to be silly. She had her attorney draw the papers that week. I drove to Seattle on a Saturday, and she signed the deed at her kitchen table, the same oak table that would eventually stand in the craftsman's kitchen. And she pressed the original copy into my hands and said, "You'll know what to do with it." I paid the transfer taxes and recorded the deed at the King County Recorder's office and filed my copy in the locked drawer of my work desk. The house was mine. It had been mine from that Saturday morning. Everything that came after, including Marcus, had arrived into a situation that already existed. 2 years after Constance passed and I moved into the house, on the advice of my attorney, Sybil Crane, I placed the property in a Washington State revocable living trust with myself as sole trustee and sole beneficiary. Estate planning. Routine. Sybil had suggested it at my annual review meeting. She described it as basic protection, the kind of step that costs $400 and prevents $400,000 of complication. I mentioned the trust to Marcus once, early in our marriage, during a meeting with a financial planner. He had taken a contractor call during the estate section of the meeting and had not returned to the topic afterward. He had never asked what the trust held. He had never looked at the recording. Have you ever watched someone not look at something, dear listeners? Not look away? Simply never turn their attention toward it? That is what Marcus did with the deed. For 11 years, the first warning arrived quietly enough that I almost missed it. In the year before the hotel group's offer, Marcus had begun giving interviews about the renovation, local shelter magazines, a Pacific Northwest real estate podcast, once a short segment on a Seattle morning program. In every one of those interviews, he referred to the house as my restoration project. Not our house, not the project we've been working on, just my project. Small word, enormous distance. I noticed it the way I notice everything, carefully and without immediate reaction. The second warning was concrete. In early spring, while organizing the property files, I found a preliminary title report that the hotel group's escrow company had sent to Marcus, the standard document they request in early acquisition discussions, the kind that shows the full chain of recorded instruments on a property. The report had been sitting in his email for 3 weeks. He had never opened it. The document that would have shown him everything he needed to know about the property he was preparing to sell had been sitting unopened in his inbox while he negotiated a $3.1 million transaction. Do you know that feeling? The feeling of watching someone walk confidently toward something and knowing, with absolute precision, what they have missed. I set the preliminary title report back in the file. I went back to my work. I said nothing. Some situations require no intervention. They resolve themselves. The offer came on a Thursday evening in October. Floyd had driven up from Tacoma, Marcus's older brother and his business partner, and I understood, when I saw him at the door with his coat still on and a leather portfolio under his arm, that this was not a family dinner. This was a closing meeting. I had not been invited to join it. Marcus had set the kitchen table with the good plates, which would have been a kind gesture in a different context. In this one, it felt like staging, a performance of domesticity around what was, underneath, a business transaction that did not involve me. The kitchen smelled of new plaster and cedar, one wall still open to the studs on the north side, the pendant lamp above the table throwing hard shadows on the raw wood. Marcus laid the offer sheet on the table and slid it across to me the way you slide a finished document to someone whose signature you do not need. $3.1 million. Floyd looked at his plate. Marcus looked at me. He said, "You don't need to worry about the numbers. This has always been my project." I set down my fork. I did not say anything for a moment. I folded the offer sheet in half, placed it at the corner of the table, and said, "I'll need to make a call before we go any further." Marcus smiled, the smile of a man who believes the conversation is already resolved. "Of course," he said. "Take your time." So I did. I excused myself. I walked down to the basement studio. I opened the false bottom of my old drafting table. I retrieved the manila envelope. The studio was where I did my real work. Low ceiling, north-facing transom windows giving gray light, shelves of rolled drawings and binders of recorded instruments. The room smelled of linen and old paper. I had worked there through every year of the renovation, through every press interview Marcus gave, through every contractor meeting where my name was not mentioned. I sat at the drafting table and held the envelope in both hands. Inside was the blue-backed original deed from 2009 and the trust amendment. My name, my great-aunt's name, the date, the recording number, the legal description of the property. Everything, in the right order, exactly as it had always been. I called Sybil Crane at 9 that evening. Floyd had left by then, and Marcus had gone upstairs, and the house was very quiet around me. Sybil had been my attorney for 12 years. She was 55 at the time, small and precise, with close-cropped silver hair and a dry wit she deployed the way a surgeon uses a scalpel, accurately and without flourish. She did not sound surprised when I told her what had happened. She asked one question. "Has he signed a purchase and sale agreement?" I said, "Only a letter of intent." She said, "A letter of intent is not a conveyance. We're fine. Scan me everything tonight." I scanned the deed and the trust amendment and sent them before 10 o'clock. The following morning, Sybil and I met at her office in Bellevue. She had already pulled the King County recorder records and confirmed the chain of title. We sat across from each other at her conference table, with coffee going cold between us, and went through every scenario methodically. What if Marcus argued community property? She pointed to Washington state law, RCW 26.16.010, which is unambiguous. Property acquired by gift before marriage, held in a properly recorded separate trust, is separate property. What if he argued that his renovation work had created an ownership interest? She said she would enjoy that conversation. What if the hotel group sued? She said the hotel group would discover, through their own title search, that the deal had never been executable. Their remedy, if any, was against Marcus, not me. We talked for 90 minutes. By the time I left her office, everything that was going to happen had already, in the way of legal outcomes, been decided. The rest was procedure. By the following Tuesday, Sybil had sent a formal letter to Marcus's attorney, a real estate litigator named Otto Steinberg, informing him that the Capitol Hill property was held in a separate revocable living trust, of which Vera Holloway was sole trustee and sole beneficiary, that the property had been acquired by gift prior to the marriage and was Vera's separate property under Washington state law, and that any representations Marcus had made to the hotel group regarding his authority to convey the property were made without legal basis. I was told later, through channels, that Marcus read the letter standing in his kitchen and then sat down on the floor. I was told Floyd was there and did not know what to say. I believe both parts. The hotel group's counsel requested a title search. The search took 4 days. It returned exactly what Sybil had described. Marcus's name appeared nowhere in the chain of title, not as owner, not as trustee, not as beneficiary. There had been no joint tenancy. There had been no community property agreement. There had been simply a deed, recorded in 2009, clean and unambiguous, in my name, and a trust amendment, recorded in 2011, naming me as sole trustee and sole beneficiary. His letter of intent was worth precisely nothing. Otto Steinberg sent Sybil a letter arguing that Marcus's 11 years of renovation work had created an equitable interest in the property, and that the trust instrument should be voided on grounds of procedural impropriety. Sybil replied with 4 paragraphs and 3 case citations. The argument about equitable interest in improvement work, she noted, had a body of Washington state case law that was not favorable to Marcus's position. Courts had consistently found that a non-titled spouse's renovation contributions do not convert separate property to community property, absent a written agreement. The argument about the trust's procedural validity was dismissed in one sentence. The trust had been recorded at the King County Recorder's Office in 2011 and was facially valid under Washington state law. Otto did not respond to that letter. Then there was the second problem, the landmark designation. When the hotel group's architects pulled the land use file, they found the historic landmark designation I had obtained in 2017, the one Marcus had resented, the one I had completed quietly and filed correctly. The designation did not prohibit sale, but it prohibited the demolition the hotel group had been planning. Their entire acquisition model had been built around demolishing the craftsman and constructing a boutique hotel on the footprint. The landmark status made that impossible before they even reached the ownership question. Within 10 days of Sybil's first letter, the hotel group sent a formal withdrawal notice. The deal was dead. Marcus called me twice that week. I did not answer. He had already made verbal commitments to subcontractors about a demolition timeline, materials ordered, crews scheduled, and he absorbed the cancellation penalties without recourse. His development firm took the loss. Sybil told me the amount, which I will not repeat here, but it was not small. I did not feel satisfaction about it. I felt the particular neutrality of someone watching a consequence arrive precisely where it was aimed. The title company had scheduled a preliminary closing meeting. Marcus had been so certain of the sale that he had not canceled it when the deal began to collapse. Sybil and I attended. Marcus arrived with Otto and Floyd, who had said almost nothing since the letter had come. Floyd's expression that morning was the expression of a man who is present at a thing he cannot stop and is simply trying to document it clearly enough to understand later. The conference room was beige and fluorescent, the table too long for the number of people in it. The escrow officer opened the title file without preamble and began reading the recorded instruments in order. She was without inflection, as escrow officers are trained to be. They deliver, they do not interpret. She reached the 2009 deed. She read it aloud. My name, my great-aunt's name, the date, the legal description of the property, the recording number. Then she read the trust amendment. Then she set the documents on the table and asked if anyone had questions. Marcus's attorney asked to pause the meeting. Marcus looked at the table. He did not look at me. He had the stillness of a man doing arithmetic he does not want to complete. I watched the moment arrive, the moment when a man who has spent 11 years certain he understood the architecture of everything realizes he never once read the blueprint. I kept my hands still. I set one hand on the manila envelope in front of me. The blue-backed deed was visible at the edge of the flap. Marcus looked at the envelope. He looked at Otto. He looked at the table. He looked away. He looked away first. The divorce proceeded without a contested property claim. There was nothing to contest. The revocable trust held the asset. Washington state law was unequivocal. Marcus's attorney reviewed the recorded instruments and did not file a challenge. What would he have argued? That Marcus had believed the house was his, therefore it was? Belief does not transfer title. He knew that. Sybil had always known that. 6 months after the hotel group's withdrawal, I listed the house at $3.4 million. The buyer was a preservation architect named Fern Whitaker, who had come from Portland and wanted to continue the restoration and apply for an additional state grant. We met once at the house on a gray February afternoon. She walked through every room with the attention of someone who understands what they are standing in. She asked about the plaster in the front room. She asked about the millwork under the kitchen trim. She asked nothing about the previous owner's plans for the structure. We closed on a Tuesday in April. I stood on the front porch after Fern's party had left, the bronze landmark plaque beside the door catching the last of the afternoon light. The fog was coming in off Puget Sound. The house smelled of cedar and old plaster, exactly as it always had. I had $3.4 million in the trust account, and a practice I had never stopped running, and the particular quiet of a woman who has nothing left to prove to anyone. The emotional cost was real, and I will not minimize it. 11 years of being scenery in my own home. 11 years of watching a man present the story of my great-aunt's house as the story of his own ambition. There is also a grief that has nothing to do with the money. The particular silence that settles when you understand that a person you shared a life with never once thought to ask whose life it actually was. That silence does not go away. It becomes part of the shape of things, part of what you carry forward and what you protect against the next time. The house was never his. It had always been mine. I had simply been patient enough to let him figure that out himself. If you are sitting with something quiet, something another person has underestimated or claimed or overlooked, stay patient. The deed always tells the truth. Now I want to ask you something, and I want a real answer in the comments. If you discovered that someone had been trying to sell something that belonged to you, without telling you, without asking, without once reading the document that named you, what would you have done? Would you have spoken that night at the kitchen table? Or would you have waited, the way I did? Tell me. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it today. And thank you, as always, for listening.